So must Sir John Kerr accept your advice, whatever advice you give?
Unquestionably, the Governor-General takes the advice from his Prime Minister and from no one else.
And must act on that advice?
Unquestionably, the Governor-General must act on the advice of his Prime Minister.
There is no tolerance here. He must
None whatever.
The whole question was whether he would or would not advise an election, either for the House of Representatives or for double dissolution. In fact, any time that Mr. Whitlam wanted to offer advice along those lines, right up to the time he walked out of my study, that advice would have been naturally acceptable, and had he offered that advice, I would have accepted it.
So if neither side backs down, is chaos then inevitable?
In many respects, it would.
Well, sir, then why don't you give in?
I shan't. It's not just my government. It is the future of parliamentary democracy in Australia as we know it.
On Tuesday, November the 11th, 1975, the Prime Minister, Mr. Whitlam, drove to Government House with the intention of advising the Governor-General to call a half-Senate election. Instead, the Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, dismissed the Prime Minister and his government from office. The Governor-General invited the Liberal Party leader, Malcolm Fraser, to form a caretaker administration until an election could be held.
My reaction to the whole series of events was one of bewilderment and bemusement. The dismissal itself left me stunned. It left everyone stunned. But I found it very difficult to get a grip on the fact that an elected government could be dismissed in the name of a monarch, 15,000 miles away. This was something that we dispatched with in the country I grew up in, 200 odd years before, and it seemed extraordinary to me that a man of Whitlam's stature and his charisma was enormous. No one could believe that he could be brought down in this way.
18 months before, in accordance with convention, Kerr had been appointed solely on Prime Minister Whitlam's advice to the Queen. In the history of Australia's national government, the Governor-General's action was unprecedented. Why did he break a 75-year convention and exercise the reserved powers given to him under the Australian Constitution? Did his decision mark a decisive erosion of Australia's political independence? Or did it mark the beginning of the end of constitutional monarchy in Australia?
He destroyed the monarchy in Australia.
For as long as most people still alive in 1975 could remember, the role of Governor-Generals had been low-key and ceremonial, their actions determined by the advice of the Australian Prime Minister. Nevertheless, there had been awkward moments. Lord Hopetoun, the first Governor-General, had the responsibility under Section 64 of the Australian Constitution of appointing the first Prime Minister of Australia. He chose the wrong person, picking William Lyne, Premier of New South Wales, who lacked sufficient political support. Hopetoun was able to correct his mistake by exercising another power conferred under the same section, which laid down that Ministers of State hold office during the Governor-General's pleasure. Before Federal Parliament met for the first time, he quickly dismissed Lyne and appointed Edmund Barton. Passed off indulgently as Hopetoun's blunder, the incident was soon forgotten.
Well, the fascinating thing about the Governor-Generalship is that in actual terms of the Constitution, it hasn't changed at all. There is no formal amendment, and yet there is a profound change which takes place in the office. In the first place, the Governor-General is seen as the representative of the monarch, and at the time of the Constitution, the monarch was Queen Victoria. The Governor-General is seen as being appointed by the Queen, and only the British government is involved. In other words, there's no advice taken from or coming from the Australian government. He comes as a Briton to Australia and goes. And he has two responsibilities. He has his constitutional responsibilities within the Australian constitutional system, but as well as that, he is the protector of British interests in Australia, so that he's a sort of ambassador of the United Kingdom, a super ambassador, if you like, protecting British interests. Now, as Australian governments get more confident, they say that they want some change in the situation. They want a situation in which they have some input into the appointment of the Governor-General. And this comes very reluctantly.
The 1926 Imperial Conference gave more power to the Dominion government. In 1930, the Scullin Labour government decided it was time for an Australian to be appointed to the post. It was a viewpoint that deeply disturbed the King, George V. Scullin recommended for the job Sir Isaac Isaacs, a former High Court judge.
And 2 points arise. One, what business has the Australian government got recommending anybody? It's a British government prerogative, they say. Oh no, said the Australian government. The whole tenor of the 1926 conference, the whole change, is one which says that this is no longer a subordinate situation. It should be the Australian government who recommends. And the objection, which is also shared by the King, is that he doesn't want a local man. Isaac Isaacs is an Australian. Better to have an English proconsul who goes and comes, or comes and goes, if you like. And the King is very resistant. Indeed, the King has in mind an English soldier, Lord Birdwood. But the Australians persist. Scullin happens to be in England in 1930 and persists. The King unhappily says, well, I'm a constitutional monarch and I agree. Now that sets the modern Governor-Generalship in place.
The bottom line is that the Governor-General is the de facto head of the Australian government, not the Queen, and it's the Governor-General who then has to take responsibility for the actions of the executive government. The Governor-General's position is complicated a little further by the fact that there are certain powers in the Constitution that may make his or her position a little different from those powers which the Queen might exercise in Great Britain. And in a sense it makes the Governor-General, theoretically at least, a more powerful figure.
In 1965, the third Australian-born Governor-General, Lord Casey, was appointed. The choice was far from controversial.
Pray be seated. I, Richard Gardner, Baron Casey, do swear that I will well and truly serve Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors according to law, in the office of Governor-General and Commander-in-Chief in and over the Commonwealth of Australia, and that I will do right to all manner of people after the laws and usages of this Commonwealth without fear or favour, affection or ill will. So help me God.
As a former governor of Bengal, Casey was a man of impeccable imperial connections. By the mid-60s, controversy over the role of Governor-General was a distant memory. But it was a time of great change. The Menzies era was drawing to a close. In the 6 years after he left the prime ministership, successive Liberal prime ministers adapted government policy to changing attitudes. Reverence for the royal family was beginning to break down. Changing international conditions were reordering Australian and British priorities.
It was quite a shock to Australia, and particularly the government of the day, when Britain did formally apply to join the European community back in the very early 60s. And it was a subject which caused great criticism here of Britain, of course, and people were very pleased when the French rejected the British application the first time round. They thought that ended it. But on the other hand, it did make other people think of the long-term consequences and the fact that really this sort of process was inevitable. People do pursue their national self-interest. It's what governments are put there to do. And it made many Australians on both sides of politics realise that the same thing really would have to happen to Australia in the long term.
Prime Minister Harold Holt vowed that Australia would go all the way with LBJ when President Johnson visited during the Vietnam War. The war came to dominate domestic politics, reinforcing Australia's regional focus. For many, the election of the Whitlam government in December 1972 was a watershed, marking off the Menzies years from a new era of nationalist assertiveness and domestic reform. Neither Britain nor the monarchy figured in Whitlam's policy speech. In an interview with David Frost, broadcast widely in the UK and Australia, Whitlam praised the Queen and said the system of Governor-General works very well.
Gough Whitlam himself was certainly a Republican right through his period of office and for long before. I think he realised quite keenly, though, that it was the sort of subject that had the potential to divide the country quite sharply, so he did see the need to do it in stages. And the things he did during that period of office were, I think, quite well judged. There wasn't very much argument about it at the time. The majority of people didn't really see it as a serious step towards republicanism, but more a statement of national identity, and that's the way he sold it, of course. And I think he judged the atmosphere of the times quite well.
One of Whitlam's first decisions was to cancel the New Year's Day honours list, drawn up by the previous government.
My government, and the Hawke government again, said no imperial honours. But they still continued from the States. There were a couple of, well, Curtin even gave an imperial honour or two in Australia. Some of the states, Labor governments would connive at it. Well, some, the Tasmanian one, Cosgrove, of course, made his wife a dame, and she looked the part. And he even recommended himself.
Whitlam proposed to Her Majesty that a new Australian Royal Styles and Titles Act should name her Queen of Australia, rather than Queen of the United Kingdom and Australia. According to Whitlam's account, the Queen very much welcomed his proposal. After a public opinion survey in September 1973, Advance Australia Fair replaced God Save the Queen as the national anthem for all but royal occasions. Much more contentious was Labour's social reform programme and the means by which it would be implemented and funded. Even the speed at which bills were put to Parliament worried the opposition parties and their supporters. So did the unconventional approach of some Labour ministers. Because senators are elected under a voting system heavily weighted in favour of the small states, the opposition parties were in the majority for most of that period. Over the next 3 years, they relentlessly denied the Whitlam government's mandate for reform.
We had a Senate which within 10 or 12 weeks of our election in 72 was threatening to dismiss the government, to take action to see that we couldn't govern, and continued to reject more legislation in that 3-year period, 72 to 75, than they had done from 1900 to 1972, where they continually sort of held up, amended, rejected, did everything possible to make Australia ungovernable. They just didn't accept that the Australian people had the right to elect a Labor government.
In the first sitting of the new Parliament, the leader of the opposition in the Senate, Reg Withers, argued that the election of Whitlam simply reflected a small swing in voting. Withers, nicknamed the toe cutter because of his uncompromising approach, was implacable.
And how does Mr. Whitlam talk about democracy being frail in Australia? He says democracy is frail in Australia because one chamber of this Parliament is prepared to exercise its rights which was guaranteed under the Constitution. And he and his party are the people who are putting democracy under attack in this country, not the Senate, not the Senate. And for him to stand here and lecture us about the frailty of democracy when he and his party and his supporters outside are doing more to pull it down than anybody else in the community.
A year later, with a Senate election looming, the Labour leadership devised a scheme by which it hoped to win control of the Senate. They offered a diplomatic post to the Conservative Democratic Labour Party leader, Senator Vince Gare, creating an extra vacancy which Labour had a good chance of picking up. Gare, who was disillusioned with his colleagues, accepted the offer.
Senator Gare was appointed as an outright political bribe offered to a man by a government in a shameful way to gain control of a democratically elected chamber of the Parliament, that is the Senate.
When the government submitted its budget bills to the Senate in April, the opposition signalled its intention to block their passage until the government agreed to hold a House of Representatives election at the same time as the scheduled poll for half the Senate. The Senate had never before used its power to defer or reject a money bill. Whitlam's reaction was to visit the Governor-General to request a double dissolution of Parliament, a spill of all seats in both houses. The Constitution allowed such an action because of the pattern of the Senate's rejection of several major pieces of legislation. The government was returned to office, although with a smaller majority. The unsuccessful contender, opposition leader Snedden, was replaced by Malcolm Fraser in March 1975. Fraser didn't rule out a repeat decision to block supply.
I made a clear statement of principle in March, and I adhere to that statement of principle very rigidly, very firmly.
That was a statement that reprehensible and extraordinary events could first force an early election. Is that correct?
No, the actual statement was that I believed a government that had a majority in the lower house should run its full time, unless extraordinary or reprehensible events intervened.
This bill, sir, is to create the Petroleum and Minerals Authority.
Controversy struck soon enough when a meeting of the Executive Council, held without the knowledge of the Governor-General, approved a plan by Energy Minister Rex Connor to raise $4 billion for infrastructure.
It's pretty clear now, I think, that the meeting was deliberately called at a time when the Governor-General was out of town and wouldn't be present. There were many reasons for that, I guess. It was a fairly unorthodox course of action that was being pursued. Nobody has seriously challenged its legality except on grounds of what the money might have been spent for. But it probably would have attracted questions and attention which would have been unwelcome in all those circumstances, so they chose to avoid the risk of upsetting the Governor-General.
The chain of events that would trigger the 1975 crisis was underway. Although the opposition had lost control of the Senate at the 1974 election, Attorney General Lionel Murphy's appointment to the High Court was to change the situation dramatically. Rather than following convention, the New South Wales Premier Tom Lewis appointed a non-Labour replacement, Cleaver Bunton. The death of the Queensland Senator Bert Milliner created a second vacancy. Queensland Premier Joe Bjelke-Petersen appointed as replacement Pat Field, a man who declared Labour sympathies but opposed the Whitlam program. The opposition now had control of the Senate.
There are some good men in the Labour Party, no doubt about that, but they got to be a bunch of yes men.
What about the present leader of the federal opposition, Mr. Fraser?
Oh, yes, he's a very good man.
The crisis finally came to a head here in the Senate on October 15, 1975, when Liberal and Country Party senators combined to defer the government's money bills. With those bills in limbo, the government's money simply would run out over the next 6 to 8 weeks.
The opposition-controlled Senate was able to vote in a way that withheld the appropriation and supply bills going through both houses. Now, in this situation, there were two conflicting views. One was, argued on behalf of the government, that the Senate was acting improperly in refusing the supply, and the Senate should, by convention, not intervene in those matters. The government of the day, having a majority in the lower house, traditionally should have control of the money. On the other side, it was argued that the relevant convention was that if the government was unable to secure supply, it should either resign or advise the Governor-General to dissolve the House of Representatives and go to an election. And it was the conflict between those two views which really underlay the divisiveness of 1975.
All those for an election, all those who want Mr. Whitlam to get the hell out of Canberra.
The motion to defer was carried for the sole reason that Senator Milliner, Labor senator from Queensland, had died.
The position that Sir John Kerr took was that in this situation he had a responsibility for securing government, if you like, for forestalling possible anarchy or possible illegality or what you will. There was no illegality in any act done by Mr. Whitlam. But when supply was held up by the Senate, it became that the position was, well, would Mr. Whitlam either resign or recommend a dissolution so that the matter could be resolved. Now, Mr. Whitlam took the position that he commanded a majority in the lower house and that the Senate should give way. And he declined either to resign or to recommend a dissolution. He said, as I see it, the constitutional position is clear. And under those circumstances, on November the 11th, 1975, Sir John Kerr exercised the power vested in him under the Constitution to dismiss a Prime Minister and a government.
I do remember first getting in a car and driving to the Governor-General's. And when we got there, the crowds had already assembled there, and there had been a barricade set up in front of the entry gate. And people were actually tearing it down. And I don't know at what stage we heard that the proclamation was going to be read on the steps, but somehow in the crowd that got on around, and we got into my car and drove off and got to Parliament House.
Proclamation by His Excellency the Governor-General of Australia. I made a decision which remitted to the people of Australia the right to decide how the deadlock which had developed would be resolved. It was for them to decide whether they wished to be governed by Mr. Whitlam and his colleagues or by Mr. Fraser and his colleagues. By then, supply had been obtained and things moved normally forward to an election.
The reserve powers are there as a sort of ultimate protection against impropriety or wrongdoing or breach of the Constitution. They should be used in the most extreme circumstances only, if at all nowadays. They should certainly be used with complete candour to the politically elected government. I think it is, in a sense, one of the greatest tributes to constitutional monarchy as it has evolved in Australia, that people were so outraged by what happened in 1975. The offence that was done was the feeling that this was a breach of something so deeply entrenched in our Constitution that it was an offence against the Constitution itself. Well, when the history and letter of the Constitution were explored, I think it was generally agreed that it wasn't an offence against the letter of the Constitution or against the books on reserve powers, but it was in a sense an offence, in the view of many citizens, to the notion of how a constitutional monarchy works.
What Kerr did diminish the monarchy here. It showed that the Queen was a cipher as far as Australia was concerned.
He said, I didn't consult the Queen before I acted, although I'd informed her immediately after I had acted. He said to have informed her ahead was to involve her in politics in which she should not be involved. He said, and in any case, he said, the power was mine, not hers. And if you look at the Constitution in relation to a power to dismiss, it's power not vested in the Governor-General as representative, but in the Governor-General. And then when subsequently petitions were directed to the Queen and to Buckingham Palace in respect of the acts of November the 11th, 1975, the Palace answered, this is not a Queen's power, this is a matter for the Australian government. And that was right.
At the December 1975 election, the Liberal-led coalition won with a large majority, reflecting fears about Labour's policies and approach. There was also a significant reaction against the Governor-General. Although that made a repeat of the dismissal unlikely, one subsequent Governor-General has asserted the right to act on his own judgment.
In 1983, a double dissolution was sought in a great hurry by Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser. He came out here to Government House without having requested an appointment, presented his letter, which from memory is about 5 pages long, a very well-argued case in support of a double dissolution, no doubt about that. The Governor-General of the day, Sir Ninian Stephen, a man of great propriety in this office, advised the Prime Minister that he, to discharge his responsibilities in that matter properly, would have to carefully consider that letter. And that's exactly what he did do. After all, several pages does require some attention, and he advised the Prime Minister to come back later in the day. The Prime Minister missed out on the election when he, or approval for an election, a double dissolution, at that time when he wanted it, and that was crucial for him because he wanted to announce the election at a press conference a few hours later, and history was rewritten as a result of that.
The political crisis of 1975 threw into relief features of the political system that had long lain dormant.
Well, may we say, God save the Queen. Because nothing will save the Governor-General.
The legacy of the crisis is to help us see how our Constitution works, or, depending on your point of view, doesn't work, in a period of change and controversy.